Hello, my American Studies 140 students. This is Professor Collins. This is the week 3 lecture, video lecture for this course. Or if you are in my summer version of this course, this is the first half of the week 2 lectures for this course. So, depends on where you are. So, this part of the course is basically the third of 4 parts that are on the broader history of Washington, D.C. and its evolution in terms of different aspects of its larger multidimensional sets of cultures in this period. And the period of time we're talking about is roughly between 1870 1871, the Reconstruction period in U.S. history and in D.C. history, to about 1939, the edge of World War II, the World War II period. Where DC becomes the city that it's supposed to become. As part of this, I will recommend for everyone to look at one of my YouTube video recordings, not one of me, but from the movie The American President, starring Michael Douglas as Andrew Shepard and Annette Bening as some sort of lobbyist for the environmental movement. And how they meet, and in that around the 1 minute and 7 second mark to about the 1 minute and 19 second mark of the 3 minute clip are the most important points that Andrew Shepard makes, which are of course myths. This myth that the founding fathers, when they founded DC, wanted DC to basically be the envy of the world, that it would be this sort of imperialistic, awe-inspiring city that would intimidate other world leaders in the process. That might be what they would have wanted, but that's not what actually happened. And DC was never that city prior to the 20th century, and certainly prior to World War II, because a capital can only be as strong or as powerful or as intimidating as the country is as a whole. If the U.S. doesn't become a great world power or the arsenal democracy or superpower during the World War II period, it cannot possibly be intimidating to other world leaders who happen to be from the UK and London and from France and Paris and from Germany and Berlin and from Italy and Rome and from, and I could go on and on and on. You get the point. So get out of your mind the idea that DC is just all of a sudden became this great world capital. It was never a great world capital in that sense, not until you get to the middle of the 20th century. In other words, so this lecture really is about how DC becomes DC, as we sort of know it, but not quite. And keep in mind a couple of things in thinking about this. As I've said in the first 2 lectures, DC is more than one DC. There is the officialdom of DC, the U.S. Capitol, the White House, the National Mall, and the monuments, the Washington Monument, and other things. Most of what we understand DC to be only starts to come to play in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It's still being drained literally as marshland and swampland at the point in time in which we start the 1870s, right? So Pierre Lafonte's plan for a planned city with monuments and paved roads and built on a northwest by southwest by southeast by northeast diamond tilted axis, right? Only really fully develops in the period after about 1880. The Washington Monument, for instance, after a 20-year hiatus, 22 years, they start building again in the late 1870s and is not finished until 1884. It's a public-private partnership between private investors and Congress, who realizes that this one-third built obelisk needs to be finished, right? So it's finally finished in 1884 with stones from a different quarry in Virginia than ones that were originally ordered back in the 1840s and 1850s. 1884 is one of the reasons why it's had structural issues over the years, why it's had to be scaffolded at least twice, maybe 3 times, I think, in the last 30 years, for repairs, for cracks from earthquakes, for other reasons. But it's the first true monument, national monument in the city, and it's only 1884, nearly 100 years after Lafont has his first plans for the city drawn up in 1791 and 1792. It ultimately is the McMillan Plan, developed by Senator John McMillan of Michigan, and through a commission, in 1901, 1902, that lays out the full plans for the city's grid system and for the what we would now call the National Mall and other parts of the city, right? So it's really not until then where Congress finally decides, hey, we've got the city developing where we have a lot of private investment, they're building businesses, people are building mansions, it's all sort of hodgepodge. How do we really unify the city? So several things come out of McMillan's plan. One is the creation of a space as part of LaFont's vision for a national park, a national gathering place for the public within the city's capital. What we would, DC's version of what we would now call something like Central Park. That's what the National Mall essentially is, right? Of course, it doesn't look anything like Central Park. It's largely clear. The main part of the mall is dirt. People play soccer on it in front of all the Smithsonian buildings and so on and so forth now. But, that had to be laid out. So the city is laid out on a grid pattern. And you might have noticed from the maps, if you've looked at any detailed street maps with DC, that if you go out from the center of the city, which essentially is where the Capitol is, the center of the city is about where the U.S. Capitol building is, right? And so it's built along that axis. So if you start off from where Union Station, Capitol Building, is, and you run your way up North Capitol Street and down to South Capitol Street, the city gets divided along those axes. And it starts with monosyllabic street names like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J. Those are all one syllables. And then those little side streets are also one syllable names. So it's one syllable. Then it moves to two syllables like Aspen Road, right? In roads that start, and they go alphabetically as well, A through Y, like Yuma Street, right? That would be your two-syllable words. Then you get to the three-syllable words like, three-syllable words like Crittenden, right? That's three syllables, right? Farragut, three syllables. And that runs alphabetically from A to about Y or Z as well. And then you get to the four-syllable words, which take you towards the borders of DC. Northwest, southwest, northeast, southeast kind of grid. And that takes you all the way to the edges, right? So those will literally come as four syllables, like Abercrombie, four syllables, right? A through Z. That's how the city is literally laid out. But those are broken up by the names of states. States like Alaska, Hawaii, Colorado, etc., etc. Those are the exceptions, and you'll see those cut through various parts of the city. And where two of those states meet, or two of those states meet in key areas, they create roundabouts, these circles like DuPont Circle, Ward Circle, the circle near Nebraska Avenue and Massachusetts Avenue meet, which is where American University is, for instance. So that's how the city is laid out, and those plans only come into play at the beginning of the 20th century, 1901, 1902. So a lot of things have to be cleared out. Shanty towns, certain alleyways where poor people in the city live, whether we're talking about poor whites or poor African Americans. A lot of that gets cleared in this early period of building out the modern DC. So that's what we're talking about here. And that process isn't fully complete, by the way, until the 1950s. I'll talk more about that with gentrification in a few weeks. But it's not until the 1950s that this process is fully realized in terms of the modern DC. That's one set of things. So in the process of all of that, you get the DC that becomes the monument DC. Key monuments, of course, being the Lincoln Memorial, which is Christian, as they say, around the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. So that would have been around July or August of 1913, where veterans from that battle and veterans from the Civil War, both on the Confederate side and on the Union side, would have gathered to the founding of, or the building of, the establishment of the Lincoln Memorial, which is finished in 1922. It's supposed to be a unified monument where, despite the battles over the Civil War, that we are still one country, and we are one country, with a common cause for freedom and liberty and justice for all. I'll talk about the contradictions of that in a few minutes. But the Lincoln Memorial is key to the building of the National Mall. The reflecting pool is built soon afterwards because people realize you don't want dirt in front of the new Lincoln Memorial. You want something to reflect on. So they built the reflecting pool between 1922 and 1924 for people to reflect, so that the Lincoln Memorial reflects upon it, and so people can reflect on the meaning of that memorial. That's how significant people thought the Lincoln Memorial was, even at the time they were building it, even though they were making excuses that the Civil War was about states' rights and we're a united country and all these other things. We'll talk about that in a moment. I'll talk about that more in a moment. Grant Memorial is built roughly around the same time, around the east end of the National Mall area. Just, it's in the roundabout area near the United States Capitol on the western side. But it's a memorial of Grant as general, not Grant as President of the United States, and there are a whole bunch of reasons for that. One of which is Grant might have been a great general, but he wasn't great as president. He was also a president that supported integration and black equality, which a lot of whites had problems with, right? So there are reasons behind why the Grant Memorial is only sort of a celebration of his generalship and not a celebration of his presidency. Of course, there's also the fact that he presided over one of the most corrupt administrations in history. He himself might have not been corrupt, but the people he hired were. They put the country into a major recession by speculating on railroads for 6 years. So there's that. Okay. And then between there are other memorials that are built during this period, but most of the major ones that you think of that might have been built prior to World War II weren't until the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, like the Jefferson Memorial, the FDR Memorial, and some of the later ones that come after that. But those are the two main ones. There are other major projects in the works for officialdom DC. Like Union Station is built between I think 1898 and 1907. It certainly opens in 1907. The first version of it opens in 1907. The Jefferson building of the Library of Congress, which is just a couple blocks away from the United States Capitol, is built in 1897. It becomes the first of three Library of Congress buildings, the other two being the Adams Building, which is built in 1926, and then the Madison Building, which is not built until the 1970s or 80s. Don't quote me on the exact date because this is way outside the period that we're talking about today. Okay, so that's officialdom DC. In the meantime, DC is being built out, right? People are buying land. Rich whites are coming to the city in the 1850s, 1860s, and 1870s, building mansions in Georgetown and in Adams Morgan, in Tenleytown and in Spring Valley, in Foxhall sections of the city and other parts of Northwest DC. They're building out along Connecticut Avenue towards what is now Chevy Chase, Maryland. They're building out toward the edges of Maryland around Potomac, Maryland, and Bethesda, Maryland, on that side. There's more growth in the northeast, but not as much. There's still farmland out in certain parts of this area, right? So there's that part to consider. But there's also Black DC. And Black DC is basically between 20 and 30% of the population throughout this period between 1870 and the 1870s and 1930s. In addition to DC being united because of the Organic Act of 1871, by 1874, DC passes a series of basically Jim Crow laws that allows for segregation of public facilities between black and white, and segregation, quite frankly, in terms of public schooling, and segregation in terms of residential segregation as well. As DC is a southern city, residential segregation isn't quite residential segregation the way we'd understand it. There isn't truly a black side of town and a white side of town. There are neighborhoods that there are neighborhoods in which there are whites that live in neighborhoods and blacks who live in neighborhoods, but they live in certain kinds of housing. For instance, in Georgetown, there are blacks who live in Georgetown. They live in what are known as servant houses for the most part in Georgetown because most of them do not have the money or the means through which to buy the kind of mansions that white folks are buying in Georgetown. Same thing goes with parts of Trinidad, and which is now parts of Northeast DC near Noma, right? And parts of Bloomingdale, parts of Mount Pleasant, and parts of Adams Morgan. They would have been living in the poor sections of the city. There have also been poor whites living in some of those sections as well, which would have led to potential clashes. Some of those clashes manifest most brilliantly, and I mean that in the most negative way I can possibly say it, in the Washington riots of 1919 in the midst of the end of World War I, excuse me. The global pandemic known as the Spanish flu, which 675,000 Americans died from and well over 2 million were infected by, and by a post-war recession where millions of people lost their jobs, black and white, but white veterans coming home figured there shouldn't have been blacks in their jobs in the first place, so they attacked the black sections of town, mostly U Street Shaw District, and the areas surrounding that, so Latroit Park, parts of Uptown that are now Mount Vernon Square and Logan Circle, part of Adams Morgan, part of Mount Pleasant, all that section where blacks tended to be is where they mostly white folks came in to burn down businesses, to beat up black men, possibly kill some, shoot at, kill, rape black women and children as well. When blacks started fighting back, including black veterans taking up areas around the city to shoot at these white mobs, is finally when Woodrow Wilson, a noted segregationist, sent the National Guard to quell the rebellion. You've got more details than you can imagine about this between the readings you have for this week and also my lecture notes, so I'm not going to go into much more detail than that. There's also the story of D.C. during the Depression years, right? Where D.C. becomes the capital for all the people, not for rich whites and corporations. The New Deal era, the era of the Social Security Act of 1935 to cover people in terms of social welfare, from what we understand as formal welfare or aid to families with aid to abandoned lives with dependent children who are too young to work, kind of thing, to unemployment benefits, to benefits for disabled folks, particularly people disabled while working, for folks who are too old to work, Social Security benefits for that group. All that comes under play during this period. But it's as a result of things like the Bonus Army March of 1932 that highlight how bad the repression is for folks, with 25 to 33% unemployment, with millions of people who are homeless, with millions of people who are experiencing more domestic violence as a result of men taking out their frustrations on significant others and wives. Murder, suicides, bank robberies, all of these things are mass migrations to places like California in search of food and work, right? Those are all part of the Depression. The Bonus Army exemplifies all this. 20,000 veterans come to D.C. to demand the benefits that they should have been given at the end of World War I. Basically, $1 for every day that $1 of basically extra pay for every day that they were part of the America's Army during World War I, which on average was $317 per veteran. The Congress had passed a law saying that they would not pay these people till 1945. There are benefits that they earned in 1917, 1918, and 1990, which seems kind of ridiculous, right? But that was the law that Congress passed in 1923 because they didn't want to spend the money. They demanded their money. They lobbied their congressmen and senators. They literally marched. They camped in Hoovervilles, which are basically rundown shacks made of wood, made of tin, corrugated roof, and tents on the National Mall along the Anacostia and Potomac rivers, and spent upwards of 3 months there trying to demand, their bonus. Herbert Hoover orders the general of the army at this time, who is Douglas MacArthur, to come in and basically get rid of them. So he burns these people out. He brings in tanks and flamethrowers and tear gas to tear gas them heck out of there. And the result is, yeah, they burn down the shanty towns, they burn down the Hoovervilles, they burn out tents and drive these veterans off, but they sicken hundreds of people as a pall of tear gas rises over the city and kills a baby, a white baby. And, it's literally one of the main reasons why Herbert Hoover gets beaten in a landslide by FDR, by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, leading to the New Deal, leading to this new relationship between the federal government and its people. And that's really where DC evolves as being the nation's capital. Not just the capital of the nation, for a select few, but the capital nation where everyday folks now can look at Washington, D.C. and say, what are you going to do to help me with flooding? What are you going to do to help me in terms of finding work? What are you going to do to help me in terms of infrastructure and all those other things? What are you going to do for me in terms of making sure that my workplace is safe? That's the DC, official DC, that evolves as a result of the Great Depression, but it's also DC that is very segregated. It's a southern DC. It's the nation's capital for ordinary people now. But it's also a DC that, has abided everyday segregation and inequality, racial inequality, racism, systemic racism, class distinctions, even as much as it is this grand city that supposedly represents equality and freedom. So that sums up a lot of what I was going to say in terms of main points for this week, for this section, if you will, for the summertime, folks. So please read the lecture notes. Please look at those for more on this. And I will get ready to do another lecture about DC from 1939 to 1974, which coincides with this one.